Hello and welcome to Now More Questions, the interview series on European affairs that gets conversations started. In this episode, we'll be discussing the defense of democracy, and in particular, the aspects related to foreign influence and foreign interference in democratic processes within the European Union. The premise of this debate is the idea that foreign actors are using and abusing online spaces and digital tools to undermine, disrupt, or even destroy the democratic foundations of the European Union and of its member states. The need to protect the EU from this perceived external threat is then expressed through a number of different legislative files, including, for instance, the European Media Freedom Act, the Digital Services Act, or other types of instruments such as the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation. But it also expresses itself through various organizations mobilized to counteract external threats, such as the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, set up by the EU and NATO, or the EU versus Disinfo project, which is part of the East Stratcom task force of the European External Action Service, focusing specifically on disinformation attributed to Russia. It was also an integral part of the Defense of Democracy package that was due to be released by the European Commission earlier this year, but was then delayed indefinitely, following mounting concerns by a number of civil society organizations that the proposed legislation on foreign interference would unduly curtail democratic expression in the EU. Meanwhile, the European Parliament has also set up a special committee on foreign interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation. That's the long name of this committee. And it presented a report that was voted in June 2023, warning that foreign interference, disinformation, and attacks on democracy are likely to continue in ever greater numbers and become more sophisticated in the run-up to the European Parliament elections in June of 2024. And we regularly hear of this threat ahead of almost all national elections, as well as important democratic occasions such as referendums, for instance. And typically, these threats are identified as coming from Russian and Chinese interference, which is why, in addition to the digital dimension of the defense of democracy, we need to understand the ways in which geopolitical rivalries and power struggles are being expressed through these digital tools. These issues are complex, and with our guest today, we will try to better understand the way in which digital spaces are offering new challenges for democracy, whereas they were initially presented as means of liberating and democratizing freedom of speech. And we will try to assess how much of a threat foreign interference actually represents and what should be the European Union's response. Līga Rozentāle has over 20 years of experience on government digital transformation, security and public policy. She serves on the advisory group of the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. She has a lot of experience in cyber diplomacy, having previously worked at the EU, NATO and the UN, as well as Microsoft. She is currently developing an independent consultancy in her own name. Līga, welcome to the show and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
So in the tradition of Now More Questions, we kick off the interview with a question from our previous speaker. That was Petra Bertova. She was co-organizer of the Stop 5G campaign, and she was interviewed on the topic of virtual worlds.
The European people have not been asked whether they want their lives to be totally digitalized. In particular, they were not involved in the pros and cons of wireless rollout. Do you really think that digital technologies, especially 5G in conjunction with the Internet of Things and of Bodies, will lead to more democracy?
Thinking about the impact of digital technology and populations not necessarily being informed on how technology is being adopted. I think consumers are driving the adoption of technology. I would push back on the question that consumers and citizens haven't been part of the process. Consumers decide every single day by purchasing items. You subscribe to Netflix, you use Microsoft, you choose the products and services. You want your refrigerator to tell you when the light's out and these kind of things. I mean, I'm a big fan of my own washing machine that alerts me when my solar power is high enough to use so that I will be having the best power consumption due to solar power. These are decisions I make all the time. I would be blind and completely uninformed if I thought that there were not consequences to using digital products and services. That said, I do work in the field of cybersecurity. I have much more visibility about the risks. Um, so my answer would be is I don't think that these things are bringing us more democracy. I don't think they're bringing us less democracy either. I think that people have to be both responsible for their own risk that they're taking on by using digital services and the products and services that they're buying, but also there has to be government regulation on companies who are perhaps don't share the values of democracy, are more interested in using data for different purposes. And also, what is the security of all these products and services? Are they secure from different attacks through vulnerabilities, or at least is that attack surface reduced as much as possible? It can never be reduced completely, but there could be measures taken to reduce your attack surface.
Yeah, the consumer is definitely engaged in the process, is engaging every day in the process, even if there's not necessarily some kind of democratic referendum on the issue. As you mentioned this issue, and something that you work on a lot in relation to cybersecurity, so you understand some of the aspects behind these digital tools that maybe some of us are not informed enough, and that's definitely a shame. So can we just start with that, actually? Can you just give us a sense, a definition maybe, of what cybersecurity actually is and means, and why it's important?
No. And I'll tell you why I'm going to say no. It's certainly the importance can be addressed. But as far as definitions, I think technology develops every day. Legislation develops every day. And finding definitions is one of the most difficult parts of addressing technology from a legislative point of view. I've had the pleasure to sit within the Council of the EU and also lead working groups when I was, leading the telecom working group and the cyber working group in Council and working on legislation. And one of the most difficult things was to define definitions within legislation. Since there is such a proliferation of legislation throughout the EU, that's probably a different podcast if you want to address if that's worthwhile. Addressing issues on technology when they cover so many different aspects of, different sectors is extremely difficult. Of course, different definitions apply to different pieces of legislation, and there is, of course, efforts to have best legislation across EU different files. But it's, you always have to speak with a bit of a caveat that there are terms that come up every day in the press and the media and in different political discussions that there is not consensus on what those terms mean. So definitions aside, we can talk more about the importance of cybersecurity. As referring to the question from your previous speaker, is the public involved in this decision making? It's important because every single person on the globe, limited to some exceptions, is linked to cybersecurity and how that affects them, how their bank accounts are secure, how their medical information is secure, and are there more and more video cameras involved in IoT products? Are those secure, and where does that information go, and how does that make people more vulnerable? So addressing cybersecurity, it's the security of your home, it's the security of your children, it's the security of your health. It just has permeated every aspect of society, thus being quite important, I think.
So what you're describing here, as I understand it, is the way that digital tools have become a part of our own security. That can be infrastructure, but it can even go to personal security. And if I understand then cybersecurity, it must be the idea that there are threats coming from that through digital means that can affect one's security or the security of one's infrastructure or the security of one's public infrastructure in the case of at a democratic level, let's say, or at a governmental level. At the same time, what we're seeing with this discussion around foreign interference is the notion of threats coming from the manipulation of digital tools in order to shape public opinion in the online space, which is a slightly different kind of threat because it's talking more about, let's say, content and ideas as opposed to direct physical infrastructure, if I may make that distinction. Are these two approaches part of cybersecurity? And can you say something about the different ways cybersecurity is approached in these two different contexts?
I think kind of disinformation and cybersecurity have always been kind of running the same race next to each other and in parallel. And where they cross is often, how do you get into email systems? The 2016 election in the US very much emphasized that email security was the path to providing for disinformation in electoral campaign. And the kind of impact that you could have by having, visibility of information within a campaign is extremely important. Of course, disinformation and the impact on democracy can be done absolutely outside of the realm of cybersecurity. You can manipulate the press, you can manipulate social media, and that does not require you to have anything to do with cybersecurity. Social engineering and these kind of social media engineering has such a high impact on the effects to democracy, elections, and so forth. I mean, if you take a look at a platform such as TikTok, which will be the largest media platform in the next few years, surpassing all conventional media and media, newspapers, television, and so forth, you have a whole different new kind of platform that is influencing democracy. Is that an issue for cybersecurity? Well, you could certainly kind of reverse engineer that problem and think about, okay, if it's an issue of data localization, then maybe you can bring it back to cybersecurity. How is data analyzed? How is it transferred? How is it used? And what kind of security do you put on data to be able to be more secure? That gets into more, more complex technical issues that influence possible disinformation. So it's not necessarily an easy question to answer. While cybersecurity, certainly cyber attacks can influence populations to lose trust in their governments. If your critical infrastructure is being attacked and taken down, you think, the government can't secure me. And so that's kind of a way that a foreign government could implement not putting something in the media, but to diminish the trust in services, in governments, in national infrastructures and so forth. So there's a lot of intertwining between the two topics, and I think a powerful adversary takes a look at all of those options and creates a toolbox of attacks that stretch between disinformation and kind of cyber attacks and operations.
So maybe if we look at it on the side of the damage caused, okay, maybe just to help us understand what we're actually talking about. And you for instance, you raised the question of the hacking of the emails in the 2016 campaign in relation to Hillary Clinton's emails. So here we have a situation in the context of an electoral campaign where information, let's say emails, but there is information in those emails, is being released at a very specific point in time. Now, there is damage because there is a hack, so that as such can be reprehensible. On the other hand, you could argue this hack then leads to information being made available in the public space that could in fact lead to people, getting more information in the context of a kind of open, transparent, democratic debate. So here I'm basically saying, could we consider almost that there is a certain amount of civil disobedience or cyber activism you could consider is in a way part of democracy? Let's just throw it out there. On the other hand, when we're talking about damage, it's quite different when we're, let's say election software, where you could imagine some kind of a hack in the election software that would completely divert the actual result from the public vote. So it would be the result coming from the software would say such and such has been elected, whereas actually the public vote went in another direction. That would be a serious damage, let's say. I mean, that you couldn't consider this as activism at all. Okay, just to make that distinction. So how do we actually translate these threats into damage? How do we measure the damage of these threats? Because I think that for me is the key to understand how to respond to them. Is there any measurable way of actually identifying damage from cyber attacks? And can you maybe even give us some examples of that?
I think there's certainly demonstrable kind of numbers that you could quote from cyber attacks. There's always many reports, how much did NotPetya cost Maersk? It was in the billions. What was the insurance claims that were filed as a result of NotPetya? Those were also in the millions. Currently, I've looked at different kinds of evaluations of costs of cybercrime and cyber attacks, and the global numbers go into billions and trillions. But for instance, one study that I was looking at, which was the Accenture report on the cost of cybercrime, they broke it down to how much does one attack cost. So on average, a malware attack on a small company costs 1.4 million, or a DDoS attack, also 1.1 million. I mean, these are kind of tangible numbers that a company could theoretically insure itself against. So we could also have a bit of a discussion on, like, is cyber insurance something that should be required by the EU? And would that make everybody a bit more secure? Would that also deter cyber attacks? But you have the financial cost too, loss of services, loss of time that you can work with your customers, and so forth. But you also have the reputational damage, which is not so easy. I mean, you can insure against having an election that goes another way. You can insure against having kind of a hit to democracy. And, if you look at overall global democracy, there's a democracy index. Now I can't think of who was writing it, but it showed that the democracies were in decline over the last few years, that there's less and less democracies. One could probably make an argument, if I was a PhD student, I would say, okay, let's look at increase of cyber attacks versus decrease in democracy. And I'm sure that there's a correlation. But so what is the actual cost of those kind of damages? And that's a bit more, what is the cost? I'm not a human rights, lawyer or human rights. I don't work in that field. What is the cost of loss of human rights? What is, access to schools if a government in a non-democratic country decides to limit women's rights? Things like this. What is the cost of that? I'm sure there's some estimates. This is not my field, so I won't go into those questions. I mean, you could think a little bit about, if you go back to the points that you were making too, that, leaked information during an election campaign or during kind of government decision making, in some sense, you can argue that in the field of, let's say, corruption, how did governments make big deals on gigantic infrastructure projects? Where does taxpayer money go? There might be I could see a reason to argue that some information leaks there could be very valuable to the public to make them understand where taxpayer money is being spent and where there's areas where there should be more transparency, I would say. If you think about, something that I've experienced more myself, when I was still in government and while decision-making processes were ongoing on legislation, there were always leaks of how negotiations were ongoing during a piece of legislation. And it always infuriated me that media would take these kind of interim negotiation documents and point out how the EU was doing things wrong. But I would argue that that's not the end, it's not the end result of a negotiation. Different options are discussed, different proposals are made, and the end product is what counts. And that's a bit of a process where I think this kind of activism undermines the decision-making process and undermines democracy, because there are, the spirit of open debate within governments and in an international organization such as EU, you have the confidence of this kind of brainstorming process on issues where you think, it won't be held against me necessarily. And in the end, they're all defending national positions, so it's not exactly not transparent. But these kind of back and forth that goes on, that always gets manipulated by media, I think is not necessarily helpful to democracy. Can I make one more point on election software? Here, I think, is one space where there could be more done on the side of technology. There are very few governments in the EU that have electronic voting, and there's pluses and minuses to electronic voting. I participated in different kinds of studies on the impact of technology on elections. Also, during my time at Microsoft, we worked a lot on issues such as bringing election guard, kind of this end-to-end verification technology for votes, to different populations to see if that would be an option that would give more security behind voting. I think that there has to be some bit more openness on the on kind of secure electronic voting, because this is where democracy, I think, would certainly benefit if more people had accessibility to voting in their homes or for various reasons, or to make sure that those who have, limited mobility can get to voting. I think that there's a strong argument to be made for more digital voting. That said, there's different parts of that process that are vulnerable. You can, I would argue, more easily manipulate the media source putting out an election result than necessarily kind of the technical chain required for secure voting. That's yeah, okay. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, there will always be a trade-off between what is the freedom and the possibilities provided by digital tools and how critical they become when it comes to foundational democratic processes. And the more they become inherent to those processes, the more they need to be secure and reflect the real, let's say, majority choices, to put it that way, and should not be interfered with or tampered with. That's for sure. Not to say that you can't interfere or tamper without digital tools. I mean, you definitely can as well, and it has been done. So it's not specific to digital. But you raised the question of trust and how, if you don't have certain, security measures in place, this can undermine trust in, for instance, government. So the reputation of a government, if a government, let's say, public website is somehow attacked, you question whether they're able to secure you as well. But also, I think, to come back to this question of disinformation, and especially the foreign interference with regard to disinformation, because the two are often linked, there is this notion that there are, let's say, factories of trolls, right? I'm going to put it very basic, but factories of trolls trying to flood the market of ideas in Europe to thwart public opinion towards certain goals that are in the end to distrust anything coming from government, something like that. And I'm being a bit caricatural here, but isn't that also somehow the foundation of democracy, to say that we shouldn't necessarily trust government, but we should be in a position to scrutinize government? And therefore, are we not able to understand the nuances? and we're not necessarily just flooded, but actually, there are some pieces of news that are actually useful to think about. They're not necessarily fake news. They're just parts of the picture that allow us to think, to be critical. Because my worry is that if we say there is foreign interference that thwarts public opinion into having certain decisions, so let's say the Brexit referendum, there was a lot of threat to say, yeah, in the end, the Brexit referendum, they got their views because there was so much manipulation of public opinion, including foreign interference, specifically by Russia. But the moment we say that, aren't we also actually undermining democracy itself? Because people still did vote in the end. They still expressed their vote. It wasn't just, you can't just say it's linked to foreign interference. I mean, in that way, you're also undermining the rationality of democracy. And if you do that, you definitely are undermining democracy. So I'm just wondering here, how does one approach this from a cybersecurity point of view? Because there must be also some kind of value judgment as to what exactly you're protecting, if you see what I mean. Can you say something about that? Because it's really part of all this hybrid warfare discussion. There's a lot of very tense geopolitical issues behind, and I'd like to get a little bit your view on that.
Sure. I think you addressed one of the major paradoxes in democracy these days, is that freedom of speech is a threat and an opportunity for democracy, and technology drives that to extremes. I think the kind of trolls that you identified, your basic premise is correct. I don't think, those who thought of democracy thought that there would be kind of this industrial scale of trolls working to undercut any reasonable decision made in democracy by any governments. That said, thinking about what we can do from the cybersecurity perspective, it's more focused on how cybersecurity can underpin and support kind of freedom of the press, freedom of journalists, mitigate against attacks against journalists, mitigate against attacks on like NGOs, think tanks, those who support democratic processes by putting out different kind of opinions and views, and depending on the regular kind of split ideology opportunities, there should be divergent opinions in the press, but they should be coming from those who are in the business of understanding things at depth, not 5 million trolls, that are automated on just, undermining any sort of position. So it's also journalists or NGOs and this kind of civil society that is not necessarily well equipped for dealing with cybersecurity issues. Those who, I don't know how NOWMORE, works on its own cybersecurity. I could turn the tables on you. But for instance, somebody could definitely, hack your website and put up an interview supporting various non-democratic issues. So how can you, as a small, NGO, I presume, work on your cybersecurity? And there you can look at what does different providers do for small, medium enterprises and for NGOs. There's lots of corporate initiatives in this space, especially since COVID, and now certainly during the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. How do you support those who cannot support themselves, basically, and those who support democracy? And it's a civil society space that definitely needs attention and definitely needs to be taken off the limitations on cybersecurity that I think is the corporate responsibility side of cybersecurity. And there's a lot going on in this space from my former friends at Microsoft, but also from other companies who work in this space. There's lots of attention. I think that's a very positive thing.
Just as a thought, but many times we will link threats to foreign actors in or directly governments of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Those would be, as I understand it, the four that are usually put forward. Is that the case? I mean, or actually, if we are to look at it more broadly, I mean, all governments are actually involved in this kind of activity. It's just that obviously we're not on the receiving end of them in our democracies, but are our governments also in the business of creating cyber security threats, let's say outside of Europe, in other parts of the world?
Well, the premise of democracies is that we don't attack other democracies. So if you believe that, then the world is great and there's only 4 bad actors in the world and everything is fine. I think this touches on something that is quite, a controversial topic that we talk about others, but we don't necessarily talk about ourselves. It's extremely well known that Europe, EU countries, NATO allies have offensive cyber operations. What those operations are, I don't have privy to them currently, but it's often the criticism of why doesn't the US be put more under scrutiny for the attacks it does? Why isn't there more attention to things like Stuxnet and so forth that came out of CIA or what? I don't think we're going to answer that question today. I think that it is not necessarily going to be a successful cause, but discussing responsible state behavior at the global level, even though it's a bit of a ridiculous exercise since those participating are, conducting active warfare and active cyber war on others. Without that discussion, you don't at least have the kind of norm that there should be responsible state behavior. You could argue about various principles and the applicability of international law, but at least playing the theater that there should be responsible behavior is, if that's the best we can do right now, then that's what we have to keep doing. And the work at the UN, while I've had the opportunity to see it, is, let's be honest, quite boring most days, and playing a theater, but playing that theater is extremely important for the long term to try to get to some level of responsibility among governments, and at least find some way to kind of name and shame those who use, cyber attacks for kind of their own nefarious means.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I think it would help the discussion to admit also some of the actions that are carried out by our own governments. I mean, we tend to focus on the attack part of what we receive and less on what we send out. And I'd like to just maybe finish on the note of EU autonomy, because obviously we're talking about foreign interference in this context. Therefore, to limit that interference, we need to think about how, in this case, the EU can be more autonomous. And here the question comes to also the digital infrastructure. So what digital infrastructure do we have in order to make sure that it is protected? Now, as I understand it, digital infrastructure is largely not European. I suppose a lot of it will be coming from American companies, and American companies of this nature tend to have very strong links with government as well. Through all sorts of means, whether they're financial or political or strategic. So the notion of foreign interference can also come through this, because we are dependent as the EU on digital infrastructure that is not European as such. Is this a problem? So can the EU build its autonomy even if it doesn't have its own digital infrastructure? Should it develop its own digital infrastructure, and more generally, what would you say EU autonomy looks like in the field of cybersecurity?
I think that there have been many measures to address digital autonomy in the EU that focus much more on industrial policy, economic benefits to the EU, and building future technologies within the EU to address future challenges. And I think that's extremely positive. Where it gets to be, I think, unproductive is trying to compete with existing companies that provide services that have already had billions and trillions in investment over the course of up to 40 years to be able to try to compete with those services. And I think that is, quite honestly, just a waste of resources. I think the EU has to focus on how do we bring innovation to the EU? What has the US, what has Silicon Valley done that's so great and has fostered that innovation over the years to be able to create an ecosystem where innovation can thrive and focus on future technologies that could be developed in Europe? I think that there also has to be some effort to maintain those that are working on technology in Europe to stay in Europe, and maybe also, make Europe a more attractive place to foster that innovation. Bring the researchers of the world to Europe rather than having them go to other places in the world where, technology is thriving, and find ways to make it, the future Silicon Valley rather than trying to compete with the existing and past Silicon Valleys of the world and other places that it's easy to say no more Chinese, Russian, or American products, but putting that into practice where there are not alternatives is quite difficult. And to be fair, I think it's much easier to cut off the Russian and the Chinese products at this space. Okay, we're not talking about social media space because I think TikTok is a force to be reckoned with. But if you think about cloud services, for instance, it is extremely difficult and also detrimental to cut the most advanced and the most secure products off the market for critical infrastructures, for governments and so forth, when there's not an alternative yet that can take its place. So the question is how do you get those products and services that dominate from the US to work in tandem with new products and services from the EU? And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity.
Okay, because it's true that then it's a question of alliances then more than foreign interference, because foreign interference in a way is a given. The question is it desirable foreign interference or is it undesirable foreign interference? Is it foreign interference that has an intention of, as I mentioned at the beginning, undermining, disrupting, or destroying democracy, or is it a foreign interference that tries to, I suppose, nurture democracy? I'm not always sure the alliances are necessarily equal to the outcome, but in any case, what you're saying is that there is such an investment capacity with American digital tools that it would be a bit superfluous to try and replicate that on European level. And there are maybe ways for Europe to invest in some innovative aspects that would be connected to that infrastructure that might serve Europe's purposes, Europe's independence. So maybe that's the path forwards. Thank you so much, Līga, for having shared your views. It's a complex issue. It mixes lots of concepts in relation to geopolitics and digital tools. So I think it helped us to clarify some points. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I think there's lots of opportunities to work with, companies and organizations in Europe to help them navigate this space, and that's what I'm trying to do myself.
Great, and it's true that just to answer you, I mean, NOWMORE does not have much of a cybersecurity policy, so I may need to think about that. And also, then good luck with your new venture.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Well, that was Līga Rozentāle. She gave us her point of view on cybersecurity and the importance of fighting threats coming from foreign actors. There are definitely threats to infrastructure that can cause damage. But at the same time, surely we must be preserving the openness and the transparency that the digital tools and online spaces initially promised to deliver. These surely are assets to democracy and not things we need to overly control and regulate, regardless of whether or not there are foreign threats. And maybe promoting democracy is rather thinking about democratic processes as such and not preventing certain parts of the public debate not to happen. Let's have the public debate. Let's fight disinformation with debate and information, and not necessarily with regulation. What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and looking forward to see you soon. Stay tuned for our next episodes. Bye-bye.